So, as we all know, we all work for Ben and Donna Rosen. All of you, we're simply clay in their hands. And we're delighted to be together again here at Kent, as I am to be welcoming many of our distinguished speakers. We will start with one I have the rare pleasure, in fact, the first time pleasure of speaking with this very afternoon. I hope you'll all come. Daniel Mendelsohn, author you've seen in the New Yorker, the New York Review of Books, and of course you've read his books, The Lost, and we'll be talking today about An Odyssey. And here he will give us a brief 2 minutes, just so that you'll know you have to come hear us.
Good morning. I just finished watching a video that my brother sent me of Aretha Franklin singing Nessun Dorma from Puccini's Turandot. And honestly, I think we should just cancel everything today and spend the day watching Aretha Franklin videos. Since that's not possible, you should come to my session, which will be the second most entertaining thing that you could do today, because it's not about me, but about Homer's Odyssey. Corby and I will be talking about my most recent book, which is called An Odyssey, A Father, a Son, and an Epic. And it's about, partly about Homer's Odyssey and what that's about, but mostly about how my 82-year-old father decided that he wanted to be a student in my freshman seminar on the Odyssey a few years ago, and that certainly led to some fun times. That experience of teaching him, having him as a student, talking about Homer's Odyssey, so much of which is about fathers and sons and parents and children, is a major chunk of the book, but that experience led to the second crazy thing that I did that year, which is just as the seminar was ending, we heard that there was this cruise that recreated the voyages of Odysseus all around the Mediterranean. We decided to go on the cruise. And that was even crazier than having my 82-year-old father as a student. And so the book, An Odyssey, is about those experiences. It ends with my dad's illness and death, and so it sort of uses the Odyssey as a lens through which to think about life, death, parents, children, and the importance, the ever-increasing importance of the classics in our lives as well as our classrooms. So I hope you'll come listen to me. Thank you.
Even if Daniel just gave away the ending of the book, I hope you'll come listen. We next have Jim Zirin, the host of the CUNY program Conversations with Jim Zirin, practicing distinguished lawyer, author of 2 books on the Supreme Court. We'll be talking about the Supreme Court. And the title of his new book is Sex, Lies, and Litigation. The subtitle, I'm sure, will have 3,500 lawsuits, but I'm going to leave the subject of the book a surprise for Mr. Zirin.
Those were 3,500 lawsuits in which Trump was involved either as plaintiff or as defendant before he took office. Now he's facing some more litigation. But that book hasn't been published yet. My second book was on the Supreme Court called Supremely Partisan. The first book was about the Southern District of New York, and it's called The Mother Court, which has inspired the TV series you may be familiar with called For the People. If you watch it, you'll think that the only thing lawyers do in the Southern District of New York is sleep with each other, but none of that is in my book, I can assure you. But I wondered if you're curious about where the Supreme Court is headed, if you're wondering what's in Brett Kavanaugh's head, I have 2 panelists who will tell you. One is Sam Zakharoff, a distinguished professor of constitutional law, an expert in the issue of Mueller versus Trump, indictment, pardon, impeachment. He'll tell you all about it, and he'll tell you about the executive state and where Brett Kavanaugh stands on the executive state. My second panelist is Kristen Clark, who was executive director of the Lawyers Committee on Civil Rights under the law, and she is an expert in voting rights, voting suppression, and race relations, all issues which will confront the court in the coming term. Now, watch our panelists as they grapple with the hot-button issues confronting the Supreme Court: gun, gays, God, abortion, civil liberties, and of course, the unitary executive state. These panelists know more about what Brett Kavanaugh is going to do than his wife knows. And I think you'll find it interesting. It's here at 210, I believe, in Madison Hall.
And if he can wind up like that in 2 minutes, just imagine.
In case you need it.
Yes, I was really hoping for Ben's. So, charters versus public schools, a subject that was so much on our minds in the previous administration in a time of enormous change and hope, and it continues to be on our minds. We'll have a panel today, and we're going to hear from one of the panelists who will be in a debate, the economics professor of Tulane University, Doug Harris.
All right, so how many of you have ever heard of a charter school or what a charter school is? You have some idea what it is. How many of you think it's a good idea? Yeah, okay, interesting. A little bit of a mix. So we're going to have a great session. Carol Burris here in the front row is going to be my compatriot on the panel. And we're going to talk about the pros and cons of charter schools. I think there are also going to be some surprises if it's not something you've studied really carefully. I think this is actually a debate that goes back like 150 years. The charter school concept is the latest term for this, but the issues go back a long way. The questions are really fundamental about what we expect our schools to do and how we should make those decisions. So what's the role of local democracy and school districts in making decisions about schools versus turning control over to independent private organizations? Should parents be able to choose schools for themselves, or should we have attendance zones and assign based on where we live? So those are some really fundamental questions of democracy. Then we'll look at the effects of the reform. So we'll look at big national debates about segregation, and the effects of charter schools and school choice on segregation, the effects of charter schools on achievement for students who participate in them, the effects of charter schools on traditional public schools. So when a charter school comes into a community, what does that do to traditional public schools? We'll talk about how the money gets used and sometimes misused in charter schools. Going back to some of those questions about democracy and the larger role of public education, we'll talk about the effects of charter schools on communities. So one of the things that happens when we have school choice is then we're detaching the school from the local neighborhood. So the question becomes, well, what happens to the neighborhood then if we go to a charter school model? School discipline is another controversial topic. If you hear a lot of the controversies, a lot of the headlines on charter schools nationally are about discipline and excluding students and pushing out students that the schools don't want to educate or that don't really fit their model. Lastly, I think.
You see the hook.
I see the hook coming. We're going to talk about New Orleans. So New Orleans is a really interesting case. It's the most aggressive version of charter schooling that's ever been put in place in the United States, really the most aggressive school reform of any kind in the United States. So I'll talk a little bit about the results from our findings in New Orleans.
Great, thank you, perfect. I got to write about charter schools in the Atlantic in New Orleans, so I will be fascinated by that panel. So, China and the U.S. at odds. What could be a more surprising headline? Of course, we read about that every day, but to understand it better and how China hopes to dominate both Asia and maybe eventually the world, we're going to hear from a distinguished panel, including Robert Hormats, whom I get to hear again.
Thank you very much. It's great to be back here again, and want to thank Donna and Ben for their warm hospitality as always. And I have the privilege of being on a panel with two very old friends, Jessica Matthews and Liz Economy. We're going to be talking about China and particularly the tensions between the United States and China that have emerged over the last several months, but they've really been brewing for a much longer period of time. So we've got a big country and a big set of issues to deal with, and I just will take you through a couple of reasons why I think this is such a stimulating issue, because it permeates virtually every aspect of international economics, international politics, and international security, and has an enormous impact on the future of work in the American economy, the future of American technology, the future of growth in this country, and the future of opportunities for all of us and all of our children, because this is not a subject that's going to go away. One can blame China for a number of things, but China is also doing a number of things internally to strengthen its technological capability. And that means that for the first time, really since World War II, the United States has a country that can compete with it to varying degrees on economic issues, on trade issues, and on national security issues, first in the Asian region, but increasingly throughout the world. What we've seen in the press essentially is trade, focus on trade, but the real competition is for prominence, leadership in the area of high technology. That will determine the kind of jobs we have, the kind of national security capabilities we have, and the kind of global system. We're used to the global system developed in the 1940s and 50s. China has a very different set of objectives, and they're going to give us an enormous competitive run for our money. How we deal with it is going to be the subject of our panel. Come, listen, participate, ask questions. We don't know the answers, but we're certainly going to give it a try. Thank you very much.
We're not allowed to give away any of the answers beforehand, so you all have to come and participate to solve them yourself. The next man you will be seeing throughout, running hither and yon, and you can ask him any question. He will be delighted to stop his endless path to answer whatever you have. I'm lying. Michael Kramer is a very busy man, and you all have to come hear him to understand just why he's busy, and especially if you're interested in the future of the Republican Party.
And my first chore is to ask Corby to go over and talk to Daniel.
Okay. But Michael, you're on.
I am.
This is
Let's
you.
start with this just in case. Yes. So, lastly, there are at least half a dozen smart and articulate conservative intellectuals in the United States, and the people who have made, over the past several decades, the case, often persuasively, for voters to turn away from the Democratic Party and for Republicans to forego the ideology associated with the GOP's long dominant establishment wing. Today, most, if not all of them, have soured on Donald Trump to the point of apoplexy. Among this cadre, no one has been smarter and more articulate than Bret Stephens of the New York Times, and we're lucky to have him with us. And based on my own decades-long coverage of politics, okay, here I am. Mostly as Time Magazine's political columnist, I'm going to be lucky enough to be his interlocutor. I urge you to come hear Bret at 4:20 p.m. this afternoon, right here in Madison. He's going to speak about how we got here, how today's Republican Party has changed from being a political organization to something akin of a cult, where slavish loyalty to all things Trump has largely replaced whatever used to pass for independent critical thought. More importantly, Bret's going to discuss, if possible at all, how to rescue the GOP at a time when much of the world and the worst of Trumpism might survive beyond the president's own incumbency. So if you care about politics in America, if you're fearful of where we are and want to better understand where we're headed, you're not going to want to miss it. Be here. I will take names.
Michael.
Here you go.
Perfect. Okay. This is the kind of warning symbol right here. I recently had the luck to wander into an exhibition in Washington, D.C. of Diane Arbus's photography, with whom I'm sure you're all familiar. But if I gained a slight bit of understanding of it, and anyone who sees her and reads about her is riveted, I will get to gain so much more from our host, Jeffrey Frankel. You probably have encountered his work on your trips to San Francisco at the gallery named Jeffrey Frankel, which this year is celebrating its 40th anniversary.
Ben is rumored to be offering some sort of an award for the briefest introduction, so I'm going to try to go for that. My group, which will consist of a great curator from the Whitney Museum, Elizabeth Sussman, very exciting up-and-coming young artist named Wardell Milan, and myself will be talking about one of the truly strange, groundbreaking, radical artists of the 20th century. We won't just be talking about her work, we'll also be taking an in-depth look at some of her pictures. If you don't know the name Diane Arbus, you probably know some of her pictures. Think of the Jewish giant at home with his parents in the Bronx, or the child with a toy hand grenade in Central Park, or identical twins, most famously in Roselle, New Jersey. Arbus's career was brief, only 15 years. She worked as a serious photographer from 1956 until her suicide in 1971. But within a year of her death, the Museum of Modern Art had mounted a major retrospective that drew record-breaking crowds, and she represented the United States at the Venice Biennale, very prestigious international exhibition. Arbus once said, "A photograph is a secret about a secret. The more it tells you, the less you know." So today, our group will be looking carefully at some of those photographs, trying to figure out some of the secrets. Thanks.
I have to ask on behalf of Ben if we happen to have in the audience newly arrived either Mark Roos or Ken Washington. If those names ring a bell. Well, Ken Washington, may I invite you to the stage? We're going to be talking about the unprecedented technological revolution in the auto industry, and we have representatives of Ford, so we're going to have actual practitioners in the House, including Mr. Washington. And I vamp while Ben preps him. For autonomous vehicles, are you all ready to have a chauffeur that you don't know and don't see in your car drive you from your home to here? I hope you are, so that you can work and sleep undisturbed. And I think that every day we read something about autonomous vehicles and how has the U.S. industry been preparing for them or not. So here's Ken Washington with Ben.
Well, first, is Mark Royce in the room? Is he here?
Mark said no.
Okay, so Mark isn't here. Well, later today, Mark and I will share the stage with the moderator. And like never before, the automotive industry is reinventing itself, and it's reinventing itself because we're standing at a point in time of extreme revolution in technology. And the automotive industry is, of course, a great place for that technology to show up. And you're seeing that technology show up in ways that we make our vehicles, but most importantly, in the way the vehicles will enable you to move from one point to another. And it's not just about the vehicle. It's about how it will transform cities and transform the way in which we use and share and experience the art and science of mobility. So we'll have a chance to share our strategies and our plans in the future of mobility and what it means to bring the autonomous vehicle potential from the laboratory into reality as we get closer to that vision of being able to remove drivers and offer the opportunity to make vehicles autonomous, and then all the digital services that you can layer on top of that, because when you're not driving, think of all all the other things you might be able to do. And it might be quite interesting to contrast and compare how General Motors and how Ford are approaching this opportunity and this challenge, because there's no one single way in order to embrace that technology and weave it into the already quite complex ecosystems of the automotive industry. I look forward to sharing that with you, and I look forward to sharing the stage with Mark as we explore the future of transportation and mobility. Please join us.
And we look forward to hearing you. So Michael Pollan is our friend and neighbor. He lives down the road, and he's agreed to come for a second time to talk with me at Kent Presents. I will invite you to all attend, because although he and I both write about food, have been following the same people, the same food topics for years with imperfect congruence in what we believe and think, which makes for lively discussions, no food today. Instead, except mushrooms, because he did think, well, right in my backyard, there's something I've always kind of wondered about. That isn't how he began. He started reading about psilocybin, the active ingredient in mushrooms, and he goes and he forages for them in Oregon with a fabulous mycologist we've both foraged with on separate occasions. And then he drinks a brew of tea with his fantastic wife, an artist, Judith Belzer, and he writes about, in what I consider a central focal passage of the book, what it's like for him to ingest this tea and go out to a backyard right here down the road that he's known for decades. He thought he knew entirely, but then the trees come to have a completely new significance to him. His wife has a very different experience and decides she needs to lie down on the couch, but he understands once that she will be okay. He goes out, and the way he reorders and rediscovers his world becomes extremely moving, and I got to excerpt that for The Atlantic. We ran that passage, and then he graciously said it was his favorite passage in the book. It was certainly mine, and I think that it'll be ours today because it takes place a few miles down the road. But there are marvelous passages. He first became interested in psilocybin because NYU researchers were doing a study with terminal cancer patients who would emerge from their trips cleansed of the fear of death, not welcoming it, but just cleansed of the constant oppressive fear. This seems to be the only substance that has had a similar effect. It's still being studied intensively, and he thinks that it should be. But perhaps you will think something else when you come hear us this afternoon, as I hope you will. Now, we have the Middle East in turmoil, so we only deal with the lightest subjects at Kent Presents. And we have an expert who has been on the Kent stage before, Safwan Masri of Colombia and Jordan, and really the whole territory is his, the whole Middle East is his territory, and today he'll be at Kent.
Thank you. So the title of the session is The Middle East in Turmoil, and everybody's wondering probably, when has the Middle East not been in turmoil? But it's fair to say that it's never really been in the grips of as much havoc and uncertainty as it is today. And with the invasion of Iraq in 2003 and then the protests in 2011 that have been referred to as the Arab Spring, we have seen cataclysmic events that have convulsed the region and have certainly had their toll on the Western world. So what we're going to be doing today with my phenomenal co-panelists, Ambassador Frank Wisner and Jessica Matthews, we are going to unpack it all for you. We're going to make the Middle East seem simple. Kidding, okay? We cannot do that in 50 minutes or if we had all the time in the world. But what we are going to be touching upon, of course, are the facts that we have 3 civil wars waging in Syria, Yemen, and Libya, humanitarian crises, the likes of which we haven't seen in modern times. You have Daesh, even though it has lost some territory, continues to rear its ugly head, as we saw in Georgia Jordan just this past weekend. You have Iran, which we thought we had checked in terms of its nuclear ambitions, but now all bets seem to be off. Continuing proxy wars fought between Gulf Arab states and Iran, and competition for dominance over the region. The question of Israel, which until recently engagement with Israel had been a taboo subject, and now you see overtures being made by Saudi Arabia and by the United Arab Emirates. The question of Palestine, which defined everything Middle East until recently, now seems to have taken a back seat. And you cannot talk about the Middle East without talking about the MBs. You know whom I'm talking about. MBS, Mohammed bin Salman, MBZ, Mohammed bin Zayed, and there's also, of course, the third one, MBK, Mohammed bin Kushner. You have rising leadership. So we need to understand the Middle East. We need to deal with all of those issues. Jessica is an astute analyst of the Middle East. She has the ability to provide us with some light, to shed some light on the mindset in Washington to the extent that anybody can, and to tell us about what to expect in terms of U.S. foreign policy in the region. Ambassador Wisner is a career diplomat, and he is very familiar with unpacking turmoil, and he'll be able to provide us with a nuanced understanding of the region and the reactions that we should expect from regional players, including Iran. So join us this afternoon. To understand the Middle East is to really try to understand what is going on in the world with us.
Thank you.
Thank you.
I hope that Safwan will promise to rename everyone in the White House. I certainly like Mr. Kushner's name. Do we indeed have Trevor Morrison in the House? As has been promised, we have Trevor Morrison. So a subject of really little concern that hasn't been on anyone's radar is the current Robert Mueller investigation. And so to bring it to the forefront and to talk about how it might change justice in America and what we should be thinking right now as we prepare for the endlessly delayed, suspenseful results, we have Trevor Morrison to tell us.
Greetings, and thank you for having me back. It's great to be here. I'm excited about this panel. One of its many merits from your perspective is you literally don't have to go anywhere after this. We will be here immediately after this aperitif section, and our speakers are two terrific people you'll want to hear from. Preet Bharara, the former United States Attorney for the Southern District of New York, now distinguished scholar in residence with me at NYU Law School, and sometimes podcaster, as I'm sure you all know. And Jay Johnson, the former Secretary of Homeland Security during the Obama administration, has had a long and distinguished career in public service. And we will be looking at, as the little aperitif sheet suggests, Trump versus his own Justice Department, which is in some way the broader rubric under which can exist discussion of the Mueller probe, the follow-on cases including Manafort, Cohen, Stormy Daniels, broader questions about the relationship between this White House and in particular this president and the rule of law bureaucracy in the government, and what the implications are not just for our time, for this presidency, for this administration, but what the longer term implications are of a period when it at least appears that the president regards the Department of Justice as a set of lawyers who are meant to represent him personally and who therefore finds deep offense when they do things like their jobs. Hope you'll stay.
I invite you all to stay, because if you don't, Julia Benedict reminds us this is not only for the stage, this is for escapees from the audience. So please make sure that you keep with us for the afternoon. We're so excited about the program our speakers have brought us, and Ben and Donna.